Hello and welcome in this new podcast where we talk with people all around the world who are working to bring a more peaceful world a reality. We've been talking a lot with people around the world about certain very specific conflicts that are taking place in Ukraine, in Palestine. There are terrible things happening around the world, and we need a lot of wisdom. We need a lot of people to think about how we came into these terrible situations, and most of all, how we are going to get out of these wars and the terrible killing of people that is taking place. And I'm very happy and glad that today I can talk to Peter Emerson. I don't know how you express it, sorry. You may say it yourself after this. Peter, I'm very happy that we can talk to you today. Peter is a director of the deBorda Institute and has been very much politically active. Peter is from Northern Ireland, by the way. And he's been politically very active in several political movements, but is now mainly focusing on analyzing our the current ways our democracy functions and how to improve it to make it work better. Peter, thank you very much for joining our discussion. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you came to develop the theories that you have that we will talk about in this program?
Okay, yes, delighted. Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. I am the child of a mixed marriage, and my father was Irish from Cork, and most people from Cork were Catholic, but he was a member of the minority and he was a Protestant. And my mother was English. Well, her maiden name was Hemmelreich, which is a little bit Dutch. And my aunt was actually a Hemmelreich von Hempstead.
Nice.
But in theory, she was English. And she was a member of the English minority because she was a Catholic and most English people were Protestants. So I am, as the saying goes, a political bastard. And my older brother was born in Ireland, but lived in England and regarded himself as British. My younger sister was born in England and lives in Dublin and regards herself as Irish. And I'm in the middle, so I have two passports and I'm in Belfast. And as my accent will tell you, I was brought up in England. And my first job was in the Navy, the Royal Navy, as it's called. I don't know why it's called Royal, because your Navy is called Royal as well.
Marine, yeah, you're right. Yeah.
But my first assignment was in submarines, and I was in the Far East, based in Singapore, and I just asked myself, why on earth is the British Navy in Singapore and in the Pacific? And I mean, if the Chinese Navy was sailing up and down the English Channel, everybody would get terribly excited, if not upset. And here is the British Navy sailing around the globe as if it owns the thing. And I thought this is just total, nonsense. And the other thing, I mean, I had seen some of the poverty that exists in the world. And so I decided that I would leave what was definitely not part of the solution. I didn't realize at that stage that it was part of the problem.
What was part of the problem?
Militarism. And the way...
Why did you join the Navy in the first place?
Oh, family. My mother's family was very military, and her favorite brother had been killed during the war. He was in submarines, and her father had served in the army during the First World War. And my dad was also in the army during the war. So there was a lot of pressure to either join the military or to join the church.
Mm.
I'm not sure why the two were sort of competing with each other, but never mind.
Interesting, yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, so Navy it was. I spent 4 years training, then 1 year serving in, as I say, the Far East, and then 4 years trying to get out. And if my name had been Prince Charles, I would have been able to get out fairly quickly, but it wasn't. So I had to wait for 4 years. And having seen, as I say, having seen some of the poverty, I decided to do something about it. And I went to teach as a volunteer in Africa, in a school for the poor in Nairobi, and loved it.
By the way, about your, I just have to mention this. I recently saw this map posted on internet that around the world, the most celebrated day is Independence Day from England. Like the biggest festivity that's celebrated by the most people on Earth is being liberated from the UK, actually.
Oh no, the most popular national day is St. Paddy's Day.
Which is St. Patrick's Day.
Yeah, St. Patrick is Ireland.
Yeah, I know, but around the world, the most people around the globe, the most celebrated day is the being free from the UK's
Oh,
rule.
I see.
Independence Day. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Yeah. What amazed me actually when I was abroad, when I was in Africa, the amount of forgiveness that, I mean, here I was as far as they were concerned, I was a Brit, and there was no sense of why the hell were you here and what were you doing and why were you exploiting, and despite the violence of the British during the colonial period, and some of it has now come to light, as with other colonial powers around the globe, as you know as well. But the average Kenyan was quite happy to have me there, and especially when I started joining in and I was eating African foods. I mean, there are an awful lot of Europeans who are out there, and they're still living the European style of life, and they're eating cornflakes and listening to Bach, and and they don't enjoy the superb variety of culture that there is in Africa. And the African, as you know, they're very patient. We Europeans we tend to get very upset. And the other thing which is quite interesting is that we Europeans, we call Africans black. And when they looked at us, and well, in East Africa anyway, they use the word Mzungu, and it has nothing to do with color and nothing to do with geography, the fact that we come from Europe or somewhere. And it comes from the verb kuzungu. And kuzungu means to wander. So the Mzungu and Azungu, he is the white man who is wandering. And in Swahili, if you want to emphasize something, you say it twice. You repeat the root of the verb. So if you wander too much, you Mzungu and Azungu zungu. That's a beautiful language, as all languages are. So when the sun gets pretty hot, the African tends to find a little bit of shade somewhere and have a snooze. But the white man is on safari and goes here and goes there and goes everywhere. And 5 minutes later wants to go somewhere else and is always sort of impatient and wanting to do something. But if you are constantly wandering, then you get lost, and then you get a bit giddy, and then you get annoyed, and you get frustrated, you get angry. And when I was in Africa and teaching in this school in Nairobi, which is very much in the eastern side of the city and in the slum area, so it's surrounded by kids. And whenever they saw me, they used to come out and say, Mzungu, Mzungu. And basically they were saying I was a bit crazy, wandering too much.
So how did your African experience form your view on life and on what's important in life?
Well, partly that that element of patience that they have. So if they want to go somewhere, it doesn't matter how far it is. It doesn't matter what time you arrive, as long as you get there. And the other thing is that their traditional decision making in Africa didn't involve majority voting at all. And what they would do is they would sit, as often as not, under the tree, because that gives you a bit of shade. And on most occasions, it used to be the old men, but there were some matriarchal societies in Africa as well. But the folks would sit there and they would discuss and discuss and discuss. And if they didn't come to an agreement, they would go home and come back the next day and start discussing all over again. But the Mzungu was impatient. And he said, no, come on, for heaven's sake, take a decision. And we imposed majority voting. And it's amazing that we imposed this system on a country like Rwanda. I mean, how mad can you get? And in the analysis of the conflict, of the genocide in Rwanda...
Can you explain a bit why, just for people to understand what the madness is to impose majority voting in a country like Rwanda?
Rwanda basically consists of two groups of peoples, the Hutu and the Tutsi, and the Hutu are in the majority numerically, and the Tutsis in the old days were tended to be the aristocrats, if you like. And then along came the white man, and he decided there was an even bigger aristocrat, and he was the boss. So there were three layers of authority, if you like, and the white man was in charge. Then came the Tutsis, and then came the Hutus. And there were no sectarian killings between the Hutus and the Tutsis for centuries. I mean, their first sectarian murder was, I can't remember now, but it's in the last century. And in Belfast, we've been killing each other for years, but not in Rwanda. But then the white man came and said majority rule. Well, initially he said minority rule because he was in charge and he was the ultimate minority. But then he changed his mind after the war, after the Second World War, and said, okay, it'll now be not minority rule, but majority rule. So the Tutsis, having been in control, as it were then able to get, if democracy was pursued, they would be able to have majority rule. And when the genocide started in 1994, the slogan that they used was Rubanda Nyamwinchi, we are the majority. And it was a most un-African concept, because majority rule, as I was saying, it had never been used in sub-Saharan Africa. And the traditional way of doing things in Rwanda was the gacaca, as it's called. And there too, they would sit under the tree and discuss until they got a consensus. And there's the other interesting thing about, it was just north of Rwanda, actually, but there was, in the late 19th century, and the white man was in Africa, and we were calling the Africans primitive and using a few other derogatory terms as well. And there was a war. It was a Battle of Mpango, as it was called. And yeah, the Europeans said, oh, this is terrible. And yeah, lots of people were killing each other and so on. And then they looked a little bit more closely at the war, and the war was fought between the Waingereza and the Wafaransa, the two groups of
Which
Africans.
country are we talking? Is that Uganda, or where is it?
Yeah, it's in Uganda.
Yeah.
And the Wafaransa were called the Wafaransa because they spoke French, because they had been converted by the French to speak French and also to be Catholics. And the Waingereza had been persuaded to become Scottish Presbyterians and to speak English. So these two groups of Africans, whom we call primitive, were fighting each other because some were Catholic and some were Protestant. So it's an entirely European concept by which these people were fighting. And majority rule is an entirely European concept by which the genocide was undertaken in Rwanda.
I'd like to talk more about, you know, majority rule and the problems of it and your solution in this program. If I would like to ask actually to you to reflect on what's currently happening in Ukraine and in Gaza, the main, yeah, of course, there are terrible things happening in Sudan as well, and in Congo and many places. But let's say for the world press, these two are the most prominent at the moment. Can you, if you look at one of these contexts, pick one, I would say, and can you say how the current system that you've just been describing as majority voting, etc., how it has played a role in creating conflict in those places?
Yeah, certainly. Let me talk about Ukraine, because I lived in Moscow for some years during the 1980s. Mm-hmm. And I learned Russian, partly in Kiev, actually. I was really? My first visit to Kiev, to Ukraine, was in 1983. Mm-hmm. And unlike you folks in the Netherlands, where you are all bilingual, if not trilingual or something else, most people in this part of the world speak only English. And in 1983, having met some Dutch volunteers over here in Belfast, and they came over to help with running kids' play schemes and things, which I was very involved in. And they all spoke perfect English, of course. And there were some German friends of mine as well over here, and they did the same. And I just decided, well, to be on this planet in this day and age and to speak only one language is just not good enough. And then because Northern Ireland, yeah, the question they asked often is, well, certainly in those days, was, are you Protestant or Catholic? To which my favorite answer was, God knows. And that question is very similar to the question that was applied to the Cold War. Are you communist or capitalist? Both binary questions. So having crossed the peace line in Belfast on an almost daily basis, I then decided to cross the other one, but that meant crossing the Iron Curtain and learning another language. So I started to learn Russian, and then got on my bicycle and cycled across the Iron Curtain, and I went to Moscow. And in Moscow, as you know, Gorbachev came to power in 1985, and the basic principle of Western diplomacy is that we in the West know, well, everything actually, which means that other people don't know anything at all. And Gorbachev, well, he's a communist. How could he know anything? But he was a nice guy, and it was the end of the Cold War. And so we rushed over, lots of experts rushed over to Moscow to tell him what to do, democratization and privatization and all sorts of civilizations. And for democracy, we said, okay, Mr. Gorbachev, you need to hold elections, and then you have a parliament. And then you as president, you propose legislation. And the parliament, they'll argue about this all day. But eventually they take a majority vote. And if you get a majority, that legislation can then be put into effect. And basically we were saying, Mr. Gorbachev, you need majoritarianism. But he doesn't speak English. So we had to translate. So we said, Mikhail Sergeyevich, вам нужен, and the Russian word for majoritarianism is Bolshevism. So we were telling him to be a little Bolshevik. And we are all little Bolsheviks. We all believe in majority voting, majority rule.
I never knew that was the meaning of Bolshevik.
Yeah. The Bolshevik, it was a vote taken in London by the all Russian Social Democratic Workers' Party. And it was 19 in favor, 17 against, and 3 abstentions. So they weren't even a majority.
What episode are you talking about now?
This is 1903.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah. And they had gone to Brussels to have a meeting there, but the Russian secret police had chased them. So escaped from Brussels and went to London.
And were any British powers involved in that
No,
group? No, okay.
not as far as I know.
Okay.
No, but these folks, Lenin and others, they took this vote, and it was a relatively unimportant vote. And as I say, it was 19 to 17 to 3. So that nobody had the majority. 19 was only the biggest minority. But Lenin decided that he was a member, that his 19 were the majority, Bolshinstvo. So he called his lot the Bolsheviks, and the other lot were members of the minority, Menshinstvo. So they became the Mensheviks. And as a result of this tiny vote involving only 40 people, God knows how many millions. I mean, it's a credible story. But anyway, in 1985, we told Gorbachev that he had to be a little Bolshevik. And in 1991, when Ukraine got independence, we advocated exactly the same thing there. And in 2004, it was a presidential election, and it was Yushchenko and Yanukovych, and Ukraine was basically, it was one country, almost entirely Slav, almost entirely Christian, but it became a divided country with Russian speaking and Ukrainian speaking. Now, I speak Russian, I don't speak Ukrainian, but if I'm in Western Ukraine, they understand me. And sometimes I even understand them. But also on the question of religion, on the eastern side it's Orthodox, and on the western side it's Catholic or Uniate. But again, you're talking about a tiny difference. But we managed to divide Ukraine into two. And in 2004, Yushchenko won. So we in the West said, oh, jolly good. We support Yushchenko, majority rule, and off you go. 6 years later, 2010, and it was by this time, it was Yanukovych versus Tymoshenko in the second round. Yushchenko was still standing, but he'd been outmaneuvered by that stage. And on this occasion, Yanukovych won by a small
margin.
By a small margin, yeah. So we had to just, oh dear, go along with it. But then the protests started in Maidan, and they got horribly violent, as you know. And in 2014, the European Union, European Community as it was then called, decided to change its mind. And we decided that democracy was not majority rule after all. We decided that it was power sharing. And we rushed over to Kiev and said, power sharing, power sharing. And we arrived on the very day that Yanukovych went into exile. Putin doesn't like losing. Well, no politicians likes losing. So he then had his referendum in Crimea. Crimea had already voted in 1991. All the different counties in Ukraine had voted for their independence. And every county had been a majority in favor. Some of them a huge majority, and in Crimea only a small majority. But even so, they had all voted in favor of Ukraine being an independent country. But Putin comes along and says there's going to be another referendum. And it was held under very dubious circumstances, lots of little green men running around all over the place and things. And it would be fun if it wasn't so horribly serious. And so in theory, as far as we know, there was a majority in favor. And then there followed the referendums in Donetsk and Luhansk. And 2014 was also the year of Scotland's independence referendum. And the word Scotland, Shotlandia, was used by Russian separatists in Luhansk to justify the unjustifiable, to justify their violence. But nobody, or hardly anybody, criticizes majority voting per se. They all think that it's
Fair.
it's the way things are done. And then you had the vote in Donetsk. Now, as you know, the Russian dolls, the Matryoshka, and inside every doll there's another doll, and inside every majority there's another minority. And when Ireland left the United Kingdom, Northern Ireland decided to leave Ireland. And why West Belfast didn't decide to leave Northern Ireland, I have no idea, but never mind. And in the same way, when the Soviet Union broke up, you had Ukraine leaving Soviet Union, and Georgia left the Soviet Union, and Lithuania, and so on. And then in Georgia, you had Abkhazia leaving Georgia, and then Russia supports, in the same way that Northern Ireland, in the same way that Britain supports Northern Ireland, Russia supported Abkhazia. Well, not quite in the same way, in a worse way. And the same with South Ossetia as well. And in Ukraine, you had Ukraine leaving the Soviet Union, but then Donetsk decides to leave Ukraine, supposedly. But then a part of Donetsk is called Krasnoarmeysk, decided to leave Donetsk and to go back into Ukraine. And this little place called Krasnoarmeysk is bigger than Northern Ireland. So you had a large number of people saying that we don't want to become part of Donetsk if Donetsk doesn't want to be part of Ukraine. We want to be part of Ukraine. And the world ignores this. We just look at...
What I find very it's very interesting that you make this very direct link between sort of so-called democratic vote and conflict. Very fascinatingly, you just told me before the start of our talk that also that's the same situation in the Balkans.
Yeah.
Please go ahead. Yeah.
A little bit. In 1989, well, Moscow in 1989, it was still a one-party state. So if you wanted to be a member of the Green Party, well, you couldn't because there wasn't one. But there was a thing called the Ecological Union. And I went along to this meeting and I met there somebody from Georgia, and he was Zurab Zvania. And we started talking about politics and Northern Ireland and Georgia. And Georgia is much more mixed up than we are. I mean, we only have two religions and we all speak the same language, well, sometimes. But in Georgia, they have about half a dozen languages, and they have at least two religions, and it's much more complicated. So we started talking about power sharing, and then he invited me down to Tbilisi to give a talk. So I said, yeah, delighted, I hadn't been there before. So I went down in 1990 and gave a talk on power sharing. It was in Russian. I didn't speak Georgian, but it was very well covered by the local press, and the Irish press weren't interested at all, or the British press for that matter. I mean, it's just incredible. And then I went to the Balkans. 1990 was the year that my contract finished in Moscow. I was working there as a translator for a Soviet agency. So I then came back to home, but I'm rather fond. I'm a bit Dutch, I suppose. I like the bicycle, so I cycled from Moscow to Tirana, and in 1990 there were very few people getting into Albania. It was they had their own Iron Curtain, as you know, and all that sort of thing. But I got to the border point, the checkpoint, and the Yugoslav guy, still Yugoslavia in those days, said they won't let you in. And I looked across at the Albanian border, and there was the barrier, and it was down, and nobody was crossing it at all. There were a few folks on the other side, but nothing happening. So I spoke to the Yugoslav border guard, and I said, well, can you stamp me out? And if they don't let me get into Albania. Can you stamp me back in again in 5 minutes' time? And he said, yeah, okay, off you go. So I went to the barrier and said hello in as many languages as I could muster, which doesn't include Albanian. But one guy spoke Russian. And he said, where are you from? And I said, well, I've just come from Moscow. And he said, on that, looking at my bicycle. And I said, yeah. And he said, oh, for heaven's sake, come on in. And yeah, he gave me a week. So, and I was then, I was in Albania, and then I visited other parts of Yugoslavia, and it was so obvious that they were going to have conflict. And in 1991, I organized a conference here in Belfast. So in 1990, I was in Albania and then on my way home. And then 91, I was back in Belfast, and I organized a conference on power sharing and democracy and voting and that sort of thing. And we invited somebody from Bosnia as well, from Sarajevo. And we tried to say to the European Union, for God's sake, don't have a majority vote, not in Bosnia, because Bosnia was 40-30-20 Muslim Catholic, Muslim Orthodox Catholic. So any two could have combined against the other one, which is what happened. And in the same way that when we had our border poll here in Northern Ireland in 1973, the majority voted because the majority knew they were going to win, and the minority didn't vote because they knew, I mean, what's the point of voting if you know you're going to lose? Turkish don't vote for Christmas. And it's the same in Croatia, where the Catholics didn't vote in the Krajina, and the Orthodox didn't vote in Croatia. And then in Bosnia, and the Bosnian Serbs didn't vote because they knew that the Catholics and the Muslims had joined forces in this totally artificial way, because they, after a year, they too had their own war. And so crazy. And we did say, here in Belfast, we said, for God's sake, not a binary referendum. Multi-option maybe, but not a binary one. And we were ignored, and the Badinter Commission, 5 European Supreme Court judges said, no, it has to be a referendum, it has to be binary. And it started the war. And on the very day of the vote, the barricades went up in Sarajevo. But then back to Ukraine. Just to finish with Sarajevo, I'm quoting now from the Sarajevo newspaper a few years later on, and they said all the wars in the former Yugoslavia started with a referendum. All of them, all 4 of them. But okay, Ukraine. And as I say, in 2014, there was this vote in Donetsk and the Crimea and Luhansk. And basically, Putin had decided that Donetsk, for example, should be independent of Ukraine. So he asked the question, do you want to be independent? And supposedly a majority said, yes, we do. And then 8 years later, Putin had changed his mind. And he now wanted Donetsk to be incorporated into Russia. So he had a completely different referendum and said, would you like to be incorporated? Which is a little bit different from being independent. And apparently, in the same way that he had changed his mind, so too, what a coincidence, a majority of Donetsk people had also changed their mind, supposedly. And it just emphasizes the fact that a majority vote, as often as not, does not identify the opinion of the majority. It identifies the opinion of whoever it is who wrote the question. And this goes back to Napoleon and other majority votes. It is a crazy system that allows whoever's in charge to choose the option. And then the people vote yes or no or whatever. And supposedly this is then the will of the people. But it's just because the children don't like turnips doesn't mean to say that they like whatever else is the chef's menu.
I know it's quite much, but can I also ask you the same question about what's going on in Israel, Gaza, Israel, Palestine? like what's often being said by, you know, people who sort of have a lot of sympathy for Israel is by saying, you know, this is the only democracy in the Middle East. And look at how the freedoms that Arab Israelis have, and you know, we have to cherish that, and you know, as a sort of legitimation for what else is going on. If I may ask you, if it's not too much, how does majority vote thinking affect the conflict in Israel and Palestine?
Totally. And as we all know, Netanyahu now has the most right-wing majority coalition ever in the history of Israel. And we have this incredible idea that you can go to bed with the devil, but as long as you're 50% plus one, you're democratic. It's a crazy notion. The population of Israel is about 20% Arab. And for as long as religious affiliation and that sort of thing is considered important, there should therefore be about 20% of the members of parliament should be Arab. Well, it's not 20%, it's a bit less, it's about 10%. But there we are. And if there is a parliament with 10% Arabs, then in any government consisting of more than 10 people, there should be at least one Arab. If you believe in democracy, if you believe that democracy is for everybody and not just the majority, whether it's Hutu or Jewish or Protestant or rich or whatever, if democracy is for everybody, then the people elect the parliament, and then the parliament could elect the government. And if you use proportional representation at each of those two stages, and Israel does have a system of proportional representation, very similar to the Dutch system, actually, then you would find that there would always be at least one Arab in the Israeli government. And there was the previous government had been power sharing with Arabs, but not with Netanyahu. And if Netanyahu had, well, if the international norm for politics everywhere was that democracy should be for everybody, that all party power sharing should be universal in every democracy, and that includes The Hague, of course, where you've had some, well, you know more about that than I do, but you have had some crazy situations. I mean, last time you took over 200 days, I think it was, to sort out.
Yes.
So you have an open and democratic election, and all these members of parliament go to The Hague, and then they close the door and draw the curtains and go upstairs, and nobody knows what on earth's going on. And it's called democratic. And then the rabbit is pulled out of the hat, and apparently that's a government. And it's even worse in Belgium, as I'm sure you know. But that idea that you have an open and democratic and transparent process to be followed by something that is at best opaque, if not totally secret, the idea that you can concoct a majority with extremists, and as often as not, it's the tail that wags the dog. And this has been the situation in Israel for some time. One of Netanyahu's previous majority, supposedly majority governments, had a majority of one. And all it needs then is for that one person to change it. It's normally his.
But even if it were like 90% majority, then still it would be a problem, because I read recently a poll in which about the opinion of Israeli population about what should be done to Gaza, and it apparently said that 90% of respondents to that poll said that Gaza should be erased and the Palestinians should be removed from the area violently.
God.
So that is super democratic, you can say, but it's also extremely criminal.
I do argue that when having referendums,
It's not a it wasn't a referendum. It was like an opinion poll.
yeah. But if you are to have a referendum, and if it's going to be, definitive, and if the result of this referendum is going to be put into law, then it must comply with human rights. You can't advocate horrors like that. A bit like that. You've probably seen there was a referendum in Venezuela saying that they want half of British Guyana.
I saw that.
Oh, sorry. What a crazy notion that I can have a referendum in this house saying that I want your dinner.
Well, in a way, you can also say the establishment of Israel was by a vote in the UN about the partition plan, and all the Arab states who were a member at the moment. It wasn't a representation of the world at that stage. It was a selection of mostly Western countries and some Latin American, African, Asian countries, but not the majority of countries.
Yeah.
But they took a vote on the partition plan, and of course, obviously, the Arab states voted against it. But because more than half of their other states voted in favor, it was imposed basically on the region.
And I would argue that no decision should be imposed. And this is where we go back to African democracy, that if you don't have a consensus, then you don't take a decision. And if Mr. Trump cannot get a consensus for oil exploration in the Arctic, then there is no oil exploration in the Arctic.
Let's talk about these solutions, because we have been referencing already sort of an alternative to majority voting, but let's delve into that. Can you explain a little? You're president or chair, director of the deBorda Institute. Maybe can you first explain who deBorda was, because it's a person, and why you take inspiration from him?
Yeah, he was Monsieur Jean-Charles deBorda. So, as the name suggests, he was French. And in the French Academy of Sciences, l'Académie des Sciences, in the 18th century, people in France knew that revolution was in the air. And something was going to happen. And the ancien regime, the ancient regime, that was going to change. And it was obvious. So in the Academy of Sciences, they looked across the channel at England, because England was a democracy, and it's the only one there was to look at. And they said, mon Dieu, c'est incroyable. Because if you want to get the common will, the collective will, if you take the average, then some people are left wing and some people are right wing, but a lot of people are in the middle. And it's the same with average age and average height. Some people are very old and some people are very young, but quite a lot of people are in the middle. and if you take a majority vote, you cannot get the middle. You fall to one side or the other. And so, in l'Académie des Sciences, they said, mon Dieu, c'est incroyable. You cannot get la volonté générale, the collective will, in this way. So two of them, le Marquis de Condorcet and Jean-Charles deBorda, they invented multi-option methodologies. And basically, if you have a choice of 5 vegetables or 5 policies or whatever it happens to be, everybody can just cast their preferences, 3, 2, 4, 5, 1, or whatever it is. And you then see which option gets the highest average preference. And it might not have a majority in the strict binary sense, but if it's the most popular or the least unpopular, then okay, that'll do. And you might find actually that something is the first preference of very few, but if it's the second preference of everybody else, then for heaven's sake, that's obviously the choice. And the two systems that were invented, the Condorcet rule and the deBorda rule, and basically, if you have multi-option voting, well, there are lots of ways you can do things. You could have if you look at all those preferences, you could have a knockout system, or you could take the one with the most first preferences or the one with the least bottom preferences, or well, it's a bit like a sports league. And what Condorcet said, well, why don't we compare every option with every other option, which is what we do in football competitions and so on. Every team plays every other team, and the team that wins the most matches is the team that then wins the championship. So that was the Condorcet rule, and the deBorda rule was, okay, well, why don't we just see which team scores the most goals?
Can you explain
it's another
that?
way. And sorry,
can you explain that a bit more, how that works in practice?
Yeah, it's so if you have 5 options and people were casting their preferences, then you just award points, 5 points for a first preference, 4 for a second, and 3 for it, and then you add up all the points and see which one gets the most. So yeah, if Liverpool beat Chelsea by 10 goals to 0, then okay, that does their goal average a lot. But if they lose other matches, then it doesn't work. But normally you will find that the team that wins the most matches is also the team that wins the most goals. Yeah. So normally
so they come close to each other. They both methods. Yeah.
So more of the world systems, and there are quite a few, the knockout systems and other things. But the two systems, Condorcet and deBorda, are the two most accurate. And the difference between Condorcet and deBorda is that deBorda tends to be a little bit more nuanced, but it's also non-majoritarian. And it can identify the option with the highest average preference. And an average involves every member of parliament, even the Arabs, even the whatever. And so it's non-majoritarian. And if democracy is for everybody, then this is the methodology that should be used.
We have currently a situation in the Netherlands where there's a very much right-wing populist candidate that is known internationally. I think Wilders has won the elections by a large margin, and he's known and he is popular because of his anti-Muslim views. It will be hard to form a cabinet now because other right-wing parties have also gained, but he's seen by other parties as a bit toxic. So it will be difficult to form a majority government. I'm trying to imagine how politics could go forward from here in the Netherlands if we were not to necessarily adopt the strategies that have always been adopted.
Basically, I would argue that you have your election, which is open and transparent. I did see for the first time, and just when I met you for the first time, my friend Leo, and he showed me a Dutch ballot paper, and there you are, over 1,000 candidates, and nobody can express their viewpoint accurately by being allowed to tick only one person from a choice of 1,000. So your voting system is inaccurate, and I would argue that it should be preferential. But anyway, you have an election, and it is proportional, so you then have a parliament. What I would then argue is that after about a week, parliament itself has a vote on who should be the government. So if you have a party like Wilders, and he's quite a big party, but there's only, 25% of the seats? So he would finish up with about 25% of the government posts. And you all know what the government posts are. So you as Wilders and his crew, they would have to choose who they want and forego the rest. And meanwhile, the other parties would choose who they wanted. Now, okay, Wilders wants to be prime minister, so he would nominate himself for that probably and get his party to support him. But the system is PR. So when the parliamentarian votes, well, he might find that he doesn't have enough support because he's getting lots of first preferences from his own folk, but that's only 25%. And he won't be getting lots of first or second or third preferences from a lot of other folk. But at the same time, with the border count, the modified border count as it's called, if you had, going back to decision making, if you have 5 preferences, 5 options, and if you think, I want this one, and I don't like any of the others, if you vote for only one option, you get only 1 point. If you vote for 2 options, then your first preference gets 2 points and your second preference gets 1, and so on. So with 5 options, you would be, your first preference would get 5 points, your second 4. And if everybody does state not only their first preference, but also their compromise options, then you can identify the collective compromise, which is what politics is all about. So the matrix vote, and every member of parliament, all 150 you have?
Yeah.
All 150 of them would all vote for the cabinet of, how many ministers do you have in your cabinet?
It varies. Like
it does, yeah. It's about 20, I think.
Yes, yeah.
So every MP would vote for 20 members of parliament. But if you're voting for, well, let's take Wilder's party, and if you think you're going to get 25%, then you would vote 25% of the 20, so 5 of them, from your own party. But there's no point in voting for all 20 of your own party, because that would split your vote. And you would only get a little bit. And what you want is you want your 5 to get the quota. So you would vote for your 5, but not for any more from your own party. But your first preference will only get the maximum points if you complete the full ballot. So you're saying, in effect, come on, you're going to have a power-sharing government, and you are going to share power with other people. So choose other people from the other parties as well, the ones you think you can cooperate with. And then in the analysis, you take that you let all 150 members of parliament vote. You then find, using proportional representation, the 20 most popular, and you then see which of these most popular, in descending order, has the most points for which ministry. And it would not be Wilders who becomes prime minister.
Yeah, very, very interesting. And I think, but wouldn't it also frustrate people? That's what I wonder. Like, what are the downsides of looking at this? Because I can imagine, how can you ever, as a political party, promise to deliver something to an audience, to the voters, if you actually know from the start that it will always be watered down by consensus, etc. You know?
Yep. Well, maybe we should stop promising. And if we believe in democracy, then okay, each one of us can influence the final democratic outcome, but none of us has the right to dominate and to insist, so it has to be my point of view. And politics has been seen to be a win or lose type situation.
Yes.
Whereas with this average opinion, the highest average preference score, you're talking about involving everybody.
Wouldn't it also sort of disinterest people, because it's going to be sort of that's what I wonder. Like, I think the first criticism could be like, oh, it's going to be a sort of a tough system, only talking all day long, and you know, be you know, very, very slow and very sort of like, wouldn't it also, let's say, debilitate, slow down government to an extent that you cannot sort of make any sort of relevant changes that are needed at a certain point?
No, no. I first used electronic voting in 1991, and you have your options, and then you get everybody to cast their preferences on their smartphones, and then you wait for a nanosecond or two, and and out comes the answer. It's actually very efficient. It's much more quick. It's much quicker than the verbal process. But you have to make use of modern technology in order to benefit from them.
Are you also suggesting that a lot of things should be done by direct voting by the public? This way, if you're talking about smartphone and electronic innovation?
I still believe in the idea of representative government.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm very wary of electronic voting in a general election, for example, mm-hmm. Or in a referendum, partly because, well, certainly for as long as we have such simplistic methodologies, because they're so easily to hack.
Yeah.
And also because if you do have electronic voting, then how can you be sure that the child is not pressurized by the parent, or the husband is not pressurizing the wife, or right. So on.
Yeah.
So even with electronic voting, I still believe that we should be using polling stations, mm-hmm. and the voter goes into the polling station, casts their preferences, and then they get a little handout to say, you have voted like this. Mm-hmm. And if they're happy with that, then they put the handout into the dustbin. Mm-hmm. Inside the polling station. They leave the polling station with no information on their person as to how they have voted. And this ensures that the vote shall be reasonably honest. But when it comes back to the idea of the cabinet, there are lots of people in the Netherlands who don't like the idea of builders in government, and in Germany with the AFD, and in Ireland with Sinn Féin, and so it goes on. But if you believe also, if you know that decisions are going to be taken in consensus, that the tail cannot wag the dog, that you are going to get consensus and make a decision, or if you don't get consensus, then there will be no decision. You can do this, you can measure it, the degree of consensus, quite accurately. In fact, with preferential voting, with the modified border count, it is a precision instrument. You can identify the collective consensus as being 0.68 or whatever it happens to be. Mm-hmm. And you have a threshold, and if a law passes that threshold, then it can be enacted. And if it doesn't pass the threshold, then okay, no decision, and you go back.
So, if I may ask, like, how much has been already? I think I presume your goal and your mission is to sort of make this type of democracy more popular and actually being used in practice. Are there already places in the world that make use of this way of voting, this way of democracy? And so that's my first question. Second question would be, if we wanted to move from a current system to this more consensus type voting, what would be the steps to be undertaken to get there?
Okay, well, going to the first one, it's quite interesting to look at the actual history, because preferential voting was first advocated in 1299 by Ramon Llull, and then there was a couple of others, but then Jean-Jacques deBorda, and his ideas came out in 1770, and l'Académie des Sciences actually used them and used the border count, and it worked fairly well. And then, yeah, as I mentioned, there were traumatic times in France, and there was a new guy, and l'Académie des Sciences was changed to l'Institut Français, the French Institute, and there was a new boss, and he didn't like this consensus nonsense. And he said, no, let's go back to majority voting. Not least because that meant that he could choose the question. And he did. He chose himself. And he became the emperor in a referendum in 1803 by some ridiculous 99% margin or something. So with consensus decision-making in cabinet, what you would find, no tail can wag the dog. And also, if we take the Irish example of Sinn Féin, they in government will want to show the people that they are capable of government, capable of consensus decision making. And you've already seen this with Sinn Féin in Ireland. They have tried to show that they are more respectable than what they were during the Troubles and so on. So you know the old saying about it's better to have the camel inside the tent pissing out than outside the tent pissing in. And if Sinn Féin does get 30%, or Wilders or AFD or whoever it happens to be, or the Arabs for that matter, or the Kurds in Turkey and so on, if there is a sizable minority in parliament, then that sizable minority should also be in government and bring them into the tent. And then if they, to take the analogy a little bit further, if they carry on pissing around, then they won't get re-elected at the next time round. That is the democratic ideal, if you like. That democracy can see who does the job and who doesn't, and we can gradually improve.
Now, what do you see as the main barriers in order for, because it makes a lot of sense what you say, and especially pointing to the grave consequences of majority vote that led to war in the past, etc., and that could lead to sort of ultra-right governments really hurting the country and other people. So it makes a lot of sense. Now, what are you finding are what would be the biggest hurdle for people to accept such kind of, because it doesn't seem like that needs to be that needs to change a lot in voting, etc. It's only like a different way of thinking, basically, on what's good for the country and what's good for everyone, etc. So how would you see this? What would you see as the main problems in order to get people to accept this?
The biggest problem is the politician, because the politician likes to control things. Mm-hmm. And just as Napoleon wanted to have majority voting, it allows the politician to choose the option. So David Cameron can decide it's Remain or Leave, it's Brexit, yes or no, and he thinks he's going to get away with it. It didn't quite work with him. But the politician does like to control things, and to persuade the politician that she has to do things in a more consensual way would require, well, first of all, society in general should be in all the little organizations that we have in society generally, in our community groups and our trades unions and our sports clubs and whatever it happens to be, wherever we are making collective decisions, we should be using multi-option voting. And even if it's with the children choosing the vegetable for lunch, then why not have a multi-option vote? The other aspect of this is that I do think that the lawyers of this world should be writing a better definition of what they regard as democracy. And if you look at democratic rights in the United Nations Charter, for example, they are glib. They don't talk about decision-making at all. They say elections should be fair. Well, what does that mean? I mean, is first past the post fair? No, it's not. And they mean, when they say fair, they mean that the voter can go to the polling station without being intimidated or threatened and whatever. But the voting system should be fair, and really the lawyers should be much more. I mean, normally lawyers are able to write volumes of stuff in fairly incomprehensible language. But with
how come, like, what you says makes a lot of sense. I just said, well, how come it's still such an, let's say, fringe idea, even though it's sort of quite logical? How come we are so attached to this binary system of the winner takes it all, and however you want to call it, there's many ways of phrasing that, but why are we so attached to the majority vote?
The one thing that I cannot understand is why professors of political science and journalists and other people. Okay, the politicians like majority voting, but why do all these other people who should have a much more objective analysis of things, why they support majority voting, I have no idea. But in academia and the media, the number of people
isn't it just a lack of imagination?
I don't know. It's difficult to analyze this. It might be because of the human condition. I mean, the fact that we have 2 ears and 2 eyes and 2 hands, and we do seem to be fairly binary creatures. And you look at the planet, and it's day or night, and the tides come in and out, and there's land and sea, and everything does appear to be fairly binary, apart from the small thing of humankind. And we do tend to be male and female, but we are not opposites. And you cannot be procreative if you don't have both male and female.
But what would argue against that is actually the fact that you discovered or learned to appreciate this in Africa, which has a very, very long tradition of consensus solving of problems. And that it appears to be that the binary thing is a later stage of what's being called development, let's say.
Yeah, it is. I mean, the decision to start voting, as I mentioned, was taken by the Greeks 2,500 years ago, and then by the Chinese 2,100 years ago. The Chinese were a little bit slow on that one. They're normally ahead of the posse and pretty well everything else. And I think it was because the rulers wanted to, as it were, get on with it. And even, I mean, in China, it was just the emperor and his ministers. And in Greece, again, it was an all-male situation, but at least they had the forum. With the citizens there, but if you do have lots of viewpoints, then there is the question of, well, come on, folks, let's make a decision.
Maybe and also the size of the community doesn't allow, or it makes it more difficult, let's say, to come to certain consensus.
Yeah, if you don't have a way of doing it, if you don't have the structure, then if you have 2,000 or 2 million or whatever, then you might have. If that's the number of participants, that might also be the number of viewpoints. Yes. And so you need a methodology by which you reduce that to a consensus. But the methodology, yeah, it exists and has done now for a good few centuries. And given the advances with computers and mobile phones and things, to make a system that is totally watertight and secure and accurate and everything. Yeah, it's perfectly possible.
I know from this is a more anecdotal, but there's this party. I don't know if you're familiar with them, DiEM25. It's from started by Varoufakis in Greece, and I know that I don't know if it's really majority voting or whatever, but I know that every member gets sort of access to a sort of a panel. An online system where every idea that's being launched on international affairs, social affairs, whatever, members can all sort of vote in order to get certain things higher on the agenda, etc. It's like day in, day out, they can vote on things. Anyway, just to show that technology already can do a lot to sort of democratize, let's say.
Yeah. Yeah, I'll have to look into that, see which methodology they're using.
I will forward it to you. Yeah. Anyway, okay. Peter, I think we're at already a fairly long discussion now. It was super interesting, and I think I've only touched the surface of what else you have to say. So I think it's already very interesting. I think as a last question, I think for people who are more interested to delve into it, where can they find more of your work on this issue?
Oh, it's on our website, which is deBorda.
Yeah,
www.deBorda. That's DEBORDA StopTheWar.org.
Great. Peter, thank you so much for explaining this, this very fascinating view of democracy to us. I think we have a great deal to learn, and it's somehow sad that since the Greeks haven't really developed anything more advanced than majority voting, and we think of ourselves that our way of doing democracy is the most advanced ever. I hope that your work will sort of make people think about how things can be done in such a way that we can really avoid the social conflicts and the real violent conflicts that are actually happening in the world. So thank you so much. Is there anything that you forgot to say and you would like to still mention?
Thank you, Jakob. I'm more than happy to do this, and I just wish other countries had your equivalents and that they would discuss it as well.
Thank you so much, Peter. It's super, and I hope we can stay in touch and we can further develop also the thinking about this issue together. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Yeah, love to.
Have a great day.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.